Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take compelling sources, pull them apart, and give you the core insights. Today we're jumping into something pretty heavy: nihilism and redemption, the philosophical underpinnings of crime and punishment.
It's a great topic. We're mainly looking at a study connecting Dostoevsky's novel to philosophy, and also another piece comparing Dostoevsky and Nietzsche on redemption.
Right. And the goal here is to unpack these big ideas, nihilism, utilitarianism, redemption, as they show up in literature, see what they mean, without, making it feel like a lecture.
Hopefully not. Okay, so where do we start?
Well, let's start with that link between philosophy and literature itself. It's kind of fundamental here.
It really is. Our sources point out that literature isn't just stories. It can be a testing ground for philosophical ideas. Think about Dostoevsky, or even someone like Orwell.
Yeah, using narrative to see how these big concepts actually play out in human lives. Does the philosophy hold up? Does it break down?
Exactly. It's like a thought experiment, but with, flesh and blood characters dealing with the consequences. And it's not a new idea either.
No. One source mentions Plato being concerned about literature's ethical impact way back when. And philosophers today still engage deeply with literary criticism.
Which brings us to Crime and Punishment specifically, and the clash, or maybe the weird coexistence, of nihilism and utilitarianism.
Okay, so let's define our terms. Nihilism first. What are we really talking about?
Well, fundamentally, the study defines it as this belief that all values are baseless. Like nothing can really be known for sure, nothing can be communicated effectively. It often leads to this radical skepticism about existence itself.
So a rejection of meaning, of laws, of morality as we usually understand it.
Pretty much, core ideas include rejecting authority, which can lead to chaos or even terrorism in extreme forms. It's often destructive, deeply skeptical.
The source mentions those Russian revolutionary groups.
Yeah.
Right? Wanting to just tear everything down.
Yeah, that's a very literal, historical example of nihilism in action. It's tied to that feeling of purposelessness, rejecting God, rejecting inherent moral codes.
It sort of reminds me of Sartre, existence precedes essence. If there's no built-in meaning,
Yeah,
then what?
exactly. It leaves a vacuum. And into that vacuum, sometimes other ideas try to step in, which leads us, interestingly, to utilitarianism.
Which seems almost the opposite, doesn't it?
Huh?
It does propose a value system.
Right. Utilitarianism is the idea that the moral choice is the one that creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, maximize the good overall.
But it's focused on the total outcome, right? Not necessarily how fairly that happiness is distributed or individual rights.
Precisely. It can be quite cold and calculating in a way. So you have nihilism saying no values matter, and utilitarianism saying, well, this value overall happiness is the only one that matters.
And in Crime and Punishment, these two somehow get tangled up in Raskolnikov.
Oh, absolutely. The study paints him as nihilistic right off the bat, unsentimental, doesn't seem to care about others' feelings, just very detached.
And then he plans and carries out this horrific murder of the pawnbroker.
Alyona Ivanovna. And he tries to justify it using this twisted utilitarian logic.
Saying she's a louse, basically, and killing her would benefit the world. That he could use her money for good.
Exactly. Removing this supposedly corrupt person to achieve a greater good, it's his rationalization.
And the novel's setting itself seems to feed into this.
Totally. The opening descriptions, the grime, the heat, the drunks in St. Petersburg, it creates a suppressive atmosphere, like a world devoid of inherent meaning or beauty. It's a perfect backdrop for Raskolnikov's ideas.
Then the murder itself. It's brutal. He kills not just Alyona, but also her sister, Elizaveta, who walks in.
Yeah, Elizaveta, who's portrayed as completely innocent. It immediately complicates any simple utilitarian justification and just highlights the violence inherent in his nihilistic disregard for life.
So his justifications, revenge, money, just getting rid of someone unpleasant, they all feel like flimsy covers for something darker.
They do. And the study brings in critics like McNeil who argue Dostoevsky is actively criticizing this strain of Russian nihilism, showing how it's fundamentally inhuman, how it clashes with empathy and leads to suffering.
It's not just an intellectual exercise for Raskolnikov. It destroys him from the inside.
Right. And we even see these utilitarian ideas floating around in society in the book, like those students Raskolnikov overhears in the tavern.
Debating whether killing the pawnbroker might be morally okay for the greater good.
Exactly. It shows these weren't just Raskolnikov's isolated, crazy thoughts. These philosophical currents were in the air.
But Raskolnikov takes it further. He sees himself as an extraordinary man.
Yeah, someone above the normal rules. He believes he has the right to transgress, to step over blood if his conscience allows it, based on this idea of achieving some future benefit for mankind.
It's Napoleon complex territory almost.
Sort of, yeah. This belief that history is made by great individuals who operate outside conventional morality.
But the genius of the novel, and what the analysis points out, is the psychological fallout. His theory completely collapses after the act.
Oh, completely. He doesn't feel like an extraordinary man. He feels hunted, terrified, paranoid. He gets physically ill. The guilt is overwhelming.
So his intellectual framework, this blend of nihilism and utilitarianism, it just can't contain the reality of his own conscience, his own humanity.
Precisely. And then you have Svidrigailov, another character wrestling with nihilism.
His version seems even more hedonistic, right? Anything goes if you don't get caught.
Yeah, he's deeply immoral, cynical. But even he isn't immune. He's haunted, has nightmares, and eventually...
He takes his own life.
Right. Which further suggests this kind of nihilism is ultimately unsustainable, emotionally and spiritually devastating. It leads to a dead end.
And Dostoevsky seems to be showing the failure of utilitarianism, too.
Yeah.
I mean, Raskolnikov doesn't even use the stolen money for anything good.
Not at all. He basically hides it. And the senseless murder of Lizaveta just underscores the danger of that kind of is justify the means thinking. It can lead to barbarism.
So in the end, it's not the police inspector Porfiry Petrovich who truly corners him, is it?
No. The study argues it's his own inner torment, his conscience, that convicts him long before he confesses.
Okay, so that brings us to redemption. How does Raskolnikov find a way out, if at all? And how does this compare to someone like Nietzsche?
This is where our second source comes in, comparing their ideas. Redemption is key for both, but they mean very different things by it. It's tied up with morality, guilt, fear, God.
So Raskolnikov initially believes he can define his own morality, right? That sounds a bit Nietzschean, doesn't it? Like the master morality.
It does echo Nietzsche's idea of the powerful defining good for themselves. Raskolnikov's theory of ordinary versus extraordinary men maps quite closely onto Nietzsche's master-slave distinction.
But the analysis argues Raskolnikov isn't really a Nietzschean master.
No, because he ultimately lacks real power. He's acting out of weakness and resentment, which actually puts him more in Nietzsche's slave category, despite his delusions of grandeur.
Interesting. What about resentment, that Nietzschean idea of slave morality being born from resentment?
Yeah, the source connects Raskolnikov's motivations to that, though typically Nietzsche saw a resentment leading to inaction or a revaluing of weakness. Raskolnikov is different because he acts violently on his resentment.
Which leads to his intense guilt. How does Nietzsche see guilt?
Nietzsche links guilt to memory and the ability to make promises. The pain of guilt, the bad conscience, is sort of the price of developing memory and responsibility. Raskolnikov's suffering definitely fits that it's the inescapable memory of his actions.
Even his confession. Is it genuine remorse or something else?
Well, from a Nietzschean angle, the source suggests it might still stem from his belief in being extraordinary, facing punishment on his own terms, or maybe just fear of something worse. He still seems to believe, even in Siberia, that his idea wasn't wrong, just that he failed.
He says something like, others succeed and are called heroes, but he failed, so he was wrong to try.
Exactly. Still clinging to the idea that power justifies itself, which ties into Nietzsche's concept of the will to illusion.
The need to create fictions to live by.
Right. Raskolnikov's belief in his superiority is maybe a powerful, destructive illusion he can't let go of.
And fear. You mentioned fear playing a role.
Yeah, especially fear of death and what comes after. Raskolnikov is horrified by Svidrigailov's vision of eternity as just a bathhouse full of spiders. He still hopes for something better, which contrasts with Nietzsche's rejection of any afterlife.
That fear might even underpin his initial crime. If this life is all there is, maybe the rules don't matter as much.
Possibly. And then the punishment itself, going to prison. Nietzsche had a pretty stark view of punishment, didn't he?
Yeah, the source mentions his retributive view less about justice, more about discharging anger, the pleasure of exerting power over the powerless. Raskolnikov choosing prison could, weirdly, be seen as him taking control in that dynamic.
It's a bleak perspective. But then Dostoevsky gives us the epilogue.
Ah, yes, the ending.
Which feels different.
Very different. Suddenly, we get this quite explicit Christian redemption.
Yeah.
Through suffering, through Sonia's love, through reading the Gospels, Raskolnikov has a spiritual rebirth.
He finds faith and a path to a new life.
Yeah, and this is where Dostoevsky and Nietzsche completely diverged.
Because Nietzsche would reject that kind of transcendent redemption entirely.
Absolutely. Our source emphasizes how jarring the sudden shift can feel after the deep psychological realism of the main novel. It feels imposed, almost. Nietzsche would likely see it as a denial, a turning away from life.
So what's Nietzsche's alternative to redemption? How does one overcome guilt or the past, in his view?
It's about affirming the past, radically accepting everything that has happened, the good and the bad. His famous phrase, transforming it was into, thus I willed it.
Taking ownership. Yes, complete ownership. Not by being forgiven, but by integrating your past actions into your sense of self through an act of will. It's about agency, about saying yes to your life, all of it. No negation, no wishing it were different.
So Dostoevsky offers redemption through faith and grace, a kind of negation of the old self. Nietzsche offers redemption through self-affirmation and embracing one's history.
Exactly. The analysis suggests Dostoevsky's attempt to reconcile the psychological reality of guilt with Christian redemption creates this internal contradiction in the novel's ending. Nietzsche offers a perhaps bleaker but maybe more philosophically consistent alternative based on the power of the individual will.
Wow, okay, that's a lot to unpack. We've really seen how Crime and Punishment isn't just a story, but this incredible stage for these huge philosophical battles. Nihilism versus meaning, calculation versus conscience.
Yeah, and putting Dostoevsky alongside Nietzsche on redemption really throws both into sharp relief. You see these fundamentally different ways of grappling with guilt, suffering, and how to, well, live with ourselves after we've done wrong.
It really highlights how literature lets us explore these questions in a way abstract philosophy sometimes can't. You feel the weight of the ideas through the characters.
Absolutely. And thinking about Raskolnikov, torn between his cold theories and his very human suffering, and then seeing these vastly different paths to redemption offered by Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. It leaves you wondering, in our own lives, when we face those tough questions of right and wrong, how much are we guided by our intellectual beliefs and how much by that gut feeling, that inner voice, our actual lived experience?
That's the core tension, maybe. How do those two sides of us interact? There's no easy answer there.
Definitely something to mull over. We really encourage you to check out Dostoevsky and Nietzsche if you haven't, and keep exploring these ideas. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.